Hello, welcome to Zoonosis with Joy. I'm Joy, and today we have a special treat. This is my first ever tier list video, so it's a little experimental. Let me know what you think about it. This one is about biological weapons. The reason I decided to do this as a tier list rather than a typical sort of lecture style video was because there's a lot of different things to know about with these ones. There's a lot of information, and learning it in a list format is very easy to remember. These are things that everyone should know about, which is why I wanted to do this sort of format. It's better for a broader audience, so it's something I wanted to do, and I always really like your tier list videos anyway. I watch a lot of them. So you take a look at the list here. I mean, obviously we have some very serious ones, probably some you've heard of, like Anthrax, and some that you may have not have heard about, like Psittacosis or Tularemia. That said, some of these are significant threats to human civilization, so those are like S. And then some I don't think are very good biological weapons, probably have very limited, if no, applications. So I say that would be like F tier. This is all very subjective. Of course, you probably would rank some of these differently. And of course, I don't have every single biological weapons agent or even possible biological weapons agent on this tier list. We'd be here forever. The notable exception is one that caused a pandemic. I don't think there's any sort of significant evidence that the thing that caused the pandemic in 2020 was a biological weapon. And in any event, you all know about it. It's not that interesting. So let's move on from that. Without further ado, I'm going to start off with a very interesting one, of course, anthrax. Now, anthrax has been used as a biological weapon in the past. It is caused by Bacillus anthracis, which is an anaerobic gram-positive spore-forming bacteria. It was used in the anthrax attacks, of 2001. So an unknown assailant sent a bunch of packages through the U.S. Postal Service, which led to 22 cases of anthrax infection and 5 deaths. Now, the U.S. was studying this back in the 1950s to 1960s. It officially ended its biological weapons program in the 1970s, but the USSR and Iraq both continued research into weaponizing anthrax after this date. Now, typically when we see anthrax, we see livestock outbreaks. So you'll see sort of mass deaths with basically these bloated corpses. There's lots of blood draining out of their mouths and eyes and other orifices. Typically it looks like a lightning struck an area because there's all these dead animals in a certain sort of closed area. The spores will remain dormant in the soil, and typically what happens is these livestock get exposed to these spores, they inhale them, and they quickly die. In endemic regions, there are vaccination programs for anthrax. But what typically happens is that animals, including humans, get infected through inhaling or ingesting the spores, or open wounds get infected with the spores that way. There's limited individual-to-individual transmission because it often kills too quickly. So that becomes a bit of a problem in terms of using this as a biological weapon. Now, how does this clinically manifest? Well, typically anthrax causes massive tissue necrosis and hemorrhage really quickly after exposure. Oftentimes animals will peracutely die, which means they drop dead suddenly. I already talked about kind of how cadavers of livestock are often bloated and there's blood coming from the orifices. Acute cases in humans typically look like fever, dyspnea, which is trouble breathing. There's fever, sepsis, shock, swollen lymph nodes, and bleeding into the meninges with inflammation, so hemorrhagic meningitis. It's often diagnosed pretty conclusively on gram staining, but images of the thorax or blood serum or post-mortem tests can be performed. This is one they warn you about in vet school because if you do a post-mortem on an animal that's been infected by anthrax, there's a good chance the air will fill with Bacillus anthracis spores and you can breathe them in and die. Very bad. Treatment and control. There are vaccines. Really, it's for only at-risk populations that animals and humans are vaccinated because of the risk of vaccine reactions. If people are treated or animals are treated very aggressively early on with antibiotics, they may survive and they may recover. Cadavers that are infected with anthrax should be cremated rather than buried to avoid spreading the spores and causing them to go underground. Affected areas need to be aggressively cleaned and decontaminated as well. So This one's pretty straightforward. A is for anthrax, as they say. It is an A tier one. The reason I put it as A tier is that there's very limited geographical spread of these sort of spores. The spores will aerosolize into a certain area, but there's the limited sort of individual to individual infections. It often kills too quickly to do that. It's very effective against livestock operations. It's very effective against urban areas. It's also extremely dangerous to handle and work with. Some of the theories about the anthrax attack were that people were taking these spores and working with them underwater, which is kind of crazy to me. I don't know. It's wild. So anthrax is definitely one that is not super easy to work with, but it is around and it is dangerous. I think it's definitely worthy of A tier. You may disagree there. All right, next one is botulism. So this is the only toxin I put on the list. Toxins are basically things produced by, biological toxins are produced by microorganisms or animals or plants. I didn't want to put too many of them on the list because it's more of a mass poisoning agent really than an actual biological weapon, kind of like some of these other ones are, but botulism definitely deserves a mention. Botulism toxin is produced, of course, by Clostridium botulinum. So the botulinum toxin is so toxic that 1 gram could kill more than 1 million people. Now, botulinum is actually used medically. It's the active ingredient in Botox. So it has medical indications, of course, for a number of different things. It's super useful that way. It was used in World War II. It was tested at the infamous Unit 731 on prisoners. The Allies also feared that Germany would weaponize botulism, so they actually distributed 1 million doses of botulinum antitoxin before D-Day. After World War II, it was of course researched by the United States, the USSR, Iran, Iraq, and possibly North Korea and Syria. Now, Iraq infamously produced over 19,000 liters of concentrated botulinum toxin, specifically to be used on specially designed rockets. I think there were several of these constructed, several dozen. They had a range of about 600 kilometers, so for regional targets, like especially Iran at that point. The I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but I apologize. The Shinriko, the Shinriko cult, they're going to come up a couple times in this list. They aerosolized botulinum toxin several times between 1990 and 1995 in several terrorist attacks. The thing with botulinum is that it can be easily aerosolized, and it can kill 10% of people 500 meters downwind. It's also a food poisoning agent, so this is one you may have heard about for food poisoning. Its natural epidemiology is that Clostridium botulinum is spore-forming and lives in the soil. It's found pretty much everywhere. Typically, when we get infections with Clostridium botulinum, they affect wounds or the intestinal mucosa, but the toxin itself is produced by this bacteria, and that can contaminate food or be inhaled through aerosolized means. Most water treatment agents deactivate the toxin, so it's really in contaminated food that you'll typically see it. Now, the mechanism of action for botulinum toxin is kind of interesting. It blocks the acetylcholine neurotransmitter release. So that basically will block neuromuscular synapses and cause a flaccid paralysis. Typically, how this shows up starts off with abdominal cramps, nausea, and then vomiting and diarrhea. It causes a descending flaccid paralysis where affected people aren't able to move, speak, or swallow. Eventually, that causes respiratory arrest and they die. So if they can be supported, of course, with their airway, they will be able to survive, but it can be very dangerous that way. Diagnosis is tricky with this one. It's very difficult to diagnose in isolated cases. It's often misdiagnosed because it's not very common. The way that it's typically diagnosed, and this is kind of wild to me, but they use the mouse bioassay, which is kind of what it sounds like. You feed a little bit of the suspected contaminated food or thing to a mouse, and you wait for it to develop symptoms of botulism toxicity. Culture really only works for the bacterium Clostridium botulinum, not for the toxin itself. And of course, you want to rule out other causes for flaccid paralysis, like myasthenia gravis, that kind of thing. Treatment: there is an antitoxin for botulinum, so that is something that can be used. Of course, if you have any contaminated food, it should be kept for investigation, and then of course carefully disposed of. This is another A tier. So this one has a huge capacity for massive casualties. It's very, very easy to isolate from the soil, so that makes it incredibly dangerous. There's also multiple routes of delivery. You can poison food with it, you can aerosolize it, that kind of thing. It's been used historically by terrorists, rogue states, militaries, all around the world. However, it's not S tier because, of course, it has an antitoxin, and it's a toxin, not a pathogen, so it's not able to self-reproduce, which I think keeps it from being truly S tier. Now, Brucellosis is our next one. Brucellosis is a genus of bacteria. It may have been the 5th plague of Egypt. There's reports in the Bible, of course, in Exodus, of livestock dropping dead. I don't know about that one, but you know, it's been suggested. In World War II, of course, the infamous Unit 731 by the Japanese military, that they tested this on human beings, so it was used then. After World War II, the US and Soviet bioweapons programs both experimented with brucellosis. It's been associated with the Gulf War syndrome. It's unclear if this was natural infections with the actual brucellosis bacterium, or if this was the Iraq bioweapons program under Saddam Hussein. In the wild, typically what happens is that it's endemic to certain parts of the world: Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Typically, it's transmitted through unpasteurized milk or cheese. So this is why I recommend drinking pasteurized milk. However, I get in trouble every time I say that on the internet because I don't want to get into it right now. But you know, a lot of very nutso people are very into unpasteurized milk, and I can't take that away from them, I guess. Anyway, drink pasteurized milk if you can. I have no money. I'm using like a $60 microphone here, so it's not like I'm part of some sort of deep state cabal telling you to not drop dead from brucellosis, but okay, whatever. It's transmitted through that, but through wounds, and also aerosolized in the weaponized form. It has a long incubation period as well. It could be anywhere from 9 days to 2 months before you start clinically manifesting this. It often shows up as flu-like illness, fever, fatigue, enlarged spleen, enlarged liver, enlarged lymph nodes. This one's pretty bad for pregnant people and animals because it causes spontaneous abortion. It can infect the brain and cause neurobrucellosis. It also can infect the heart and cause endocarditis, which leads to death usually. Mortality itself is rather low, but you can have chronic carriers. This is typically diagnosed through serology or PCR methods. Usually takes 2 or 3 antibiotics used together because resistance is common. There's no commercial vaccine for humans. Again, pasteurization is one of those things that I would recommend. Not everyone would agree, of course. This is a C tier one, I think. So, brucellosis, there's not really any human-to-human transmission, so geographical spread is limited. It's low mortality. It's typically slow to incubate, which means that it can cause more social disruption and casualties in the long run. It has a lot of potential as well for affecting foodborne illness and livestock bioterrorism, especially in the dairy industry. So this one is not D tier. I think it actually could be quite useful in those sort of circumstances. It is definitely scary. It's a C tier. Next one is cholera. This one was interesting to me. It's carried by Vibrio cholerae. It's the bacteria that causes it. It's been studied as a bioweapon. To my knowledge, hasn't been used as a bioweapon. It typically is a fecal oral waterborne pathogen. This was discovered by cholera was discovered to be fecal oral based on John Snow, better known for other work, I suppose. He was, of course, the father of epidemiology, and he discovered a contaminated water pump in London giving people cholera, and he mapped it out and figured out, hey, maybe you don't drink the poop water. That probably will stop the cholera there. It's also got a vector, so it's actually carried by copepods. If you have watched SpongeBob, you know what a copepod looks like. It looks like a plankton, anyway. It's endemic to many countries in Africa and Asia. It causes about 3 to 5 million cases yearly, and 100,000 people die annually. But it's been eradicated from most of the industrialized world due to sanitation, sewage systems, and really accessible vaccinations. It typically causes a very severe diarrheal disease which can lead to death. It's diagnosed through fecal culture and treated with antibiotics. There's, of course, a lot of vaccinations, both injectable and oral, that are very effective against this one. and sewage systems and sanitation are really good. This is a D tier. So cholera has a lot of vaccinations. There's antibiotics that work well against it. Hygiene makes it really easy to control the spread. But at risk areas, I think this one could be quite devastating if it was used in the right place at the right time. So it definitely has a use, but again, I'd say its potential is limited that way. Okay, this one's hard to say. Coccidioides or coccidiomycosis. So Coccidioides is an opportunistic pathogenic fungus. Now, this one is controversial. I was debating whether or not to put it on the tier list at all. Microbiologists consider it not a potential agent for biological warfare. The American Society for Microbiologists disagreed with the listing. However, the US military did study it, and I believe the reason why they studied it was because most US military installations where they were studying these things were in the American Southwest, which is typically where Coccidioides is most commonly found. Now, clinical infections and illness are rare, except if you have HIV/AIDS. So HIV/AIDS patients, before retroviral therapy, about 10% of them develop this infection. Typically what happens is that they are inhaled and they can cause a fungal pneumonia that spreads to other parts of the body. The spores are very environmentally stable and they're easily spread by air currents. Usually people that are infected by it don't even know. It's usually subclinical or mild asymptomatic infections. However, in these immunocompromised patients, of course, it can cause a granulomatous pneumonia. It then can spread from the pulmonary system into the blood, and then it usually causes meningitis and death. This one is diagnosed by imaging and fungal serology. There's no vaccinations available. It's typically antifungal resistant, so it takes months to months and months of antifungals, which are very hard on a patient that has immunocompromised. This one I'd say is F tier. So it's very low virulence for most healthy people. I guess you could engineer it to be higher virulence, but there's a lot of things working against it. I talked in a previous video about the extinction of the dinosaurs and how high body temperatures are protective against fungi, so maybe this is going to become more pathogenic with climate change. Most microbiologists don't think it's a biological weapons agent worth noting. It needs significant improvement, I'd say. It's weird to say about something so hideous and deadly in those cases, and this is a nasty one if you do get infected by it, but as a biological weapon, it's just not there. Alright, so diphtheria. This one is surprising to me again. Diphtheria is caused by Corynebacterium diphtheriae, and of course some other related species as well. Again, it's a studied one. It hasn't really been used in a lot of contexts. It primarily affects children, immunocompromised people, people with alcohol abuse disorders, or actually if you have really bad dental disease, that also increases your risk of diphtheria. Childhood vaccinations have virtually eradicated the disease in most of the world. We'll talk about that here in a second. But there are occasional outbreaks, especially in places where childhood vaccinations are lapsed. So if you're not vaccinating your kids, they're putting them and others at risk of diphtheria. Nasty. What this looks like, basically they get a very thick gray layer on the throat and tonsils, swollen lymph nodes, there will be occasionally cutaneous lesions. It can then infect the heart or the nervous system, so myocarditis or polyneuritis, and cause death. It has a very high mortality. About 5 to 17% of cases will unfortunately pass away. This happened to one of my great aunts, I believe. And before the onset of childhood vaccination programs, this was very common. If you go walking in a graveyard of any old graveyard that's 100 years old or older, you'll see a lot of graves of children and babies, typically before 1930 or 1940. That's not so much now. You can kind of see that that's been largely prevented with preventable childhood vaccinations. But this is one I'd say is an E tier. Now, the reason I don't put it lower is because if there's a lapse in a population, if you have some sort of propaganda psyop campaign that is anti-vax, you could potentially cause some massive outbreaks of diphtheria, and it could be nastier that way. But a mass vaccination program and early childhood vaccinations are protective. They're extremely effective for this. It's the DTP vaccine, if anyone's wondering. Now, the next one is kind of a catch-all. because there's a lot of very similar diseases. Diarrheal disease, technically, sorry, cholera is a diarrheal disease, but these ones are, they have a little bit more use than cholera. So this is things like Salmonella dysenteriae, which is dysentery, Salmonella typhi, which is typhoid, Salmonella paratyphi, which is paratyphoid, Shigella, and E. coli. This one actually has been used in a bioterrorism attack. I don't want to talk too much about it because they are active on YouTube and they will, bring up issues if they can. But the terrorist attack by the Rajneeshi cult in 1984, they basically sprayed salmonella on a salad bar in order to win a local election by making everyone in town sick, and then, they wouldn't show up to the polls so they can vote in the election. These are fecal oral bacteria, so typically they're found in the feces and they spread on other things and people get infected that way, but they can contaminate water and food as well. As the name implies, they typically show up as diarrhea, so watery to bloody to mucoid stools. There's often fever, abdominal cramping, and it can be deadly if it's severe enough. They can get febrile seizures, if your fever is high enough. Of course, it can cause sepsis or hemolytic uremic syndrome. Children and the elderly are most at risk of this disease. It's typically diagnosed through culture, but also toxin detection as well is definitive. Treatment, of course, is fluids, antibiotics. It's typically self-limiting in most healthy people, but children, of course, can also pass away from this disease. This one is C tier. So I put it higher than cholera because you can really disrupt livestock operations with this one. You can contaminate the food supply. It's a high morbidity, but a low mortality, which has its uses. If you just want to get people away from the polls, I suppose this one's actually pretty decent that way. It's very, very easy to acquire these bacterial organisms. They're everywhere. There's not really any effective vaccines that work for all of these. Some of them there definitely are, especially in endemic regions. Of course, there's a potential for engineering antibiotic-resistant strains. And it also requires fecal oral ingestion, so it's not aerosolizable. So this one has its applications. This one is very scary if it's been purposely introduced into the food or water supply. Next one, something a little bit closer to home for me as a veterinarian. I'm just going to take a sip of my tea here. Equine encephalitis. This is a group of viruses. I just call it equine encephalitis. That's not super specific. There's actually 3 of them. There's Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus, Eastern equine encephalitis virus, and Western equine encephalitis virus. But I just kind of group them as equine encephalitis. So these ones are basically, they're spread by mosquitoes. They've been studied for use of biological weapons. As far as I know, have never been used as such. They cause frequent outbreaks. Humans can get infected by this, but the typical hosts are horses, donkeys, and mules. You also get massive outbreaks in birds that can destroy populations, but dogs and rodents can also become infected and become hosts of this as well. As the name implies, it can cause encephalitis. It typically shows up as fever, loss of appetite, lethargy, that sort of thing. In humans, the mortality is rather low for most of these, so about 1%. But in those 1%, it's usually they develop the encephalitis. It's typically diagnosed, I think it's generally through serology and PCR. There is a vaccine for horses. Horses are generally recommended to have the equine encephalitis vaccines because they're outside, it could spread through mosquitoes, that kind of thing. Human vaccines cause massive vaccine reactions. Their use is rather limited. There's no effective antiviral treatment protocols that have been devised so far. And mosquito control, of course, can control these as well. So netting, insecticides, that kind of thing. This one's another D tier. There we go. So there's a large number of potential hosts, which means you can become endemic in an area. It is mosquito-borne, which is, there's pros and cons. It has its own vector, but mosquito control is rather effective for this one. There's no vaccines or treatments available for humans, which I think puts it above E tier, but the low mortality, it makes it lower. And we also live in a post-horse society. I mean, I wouldn't say post-horse, for everything, but we can live without horses, unfortunately. We don't use horses for military or industrial or agricultural reasons, really. It's just mostly for pleasure and for sport, which is significant, but it's not, society breaking if that happens. So it's not like the epizootic of, like the old epizootic influenza or anything like that. So yeah, I'd say that's a D tier right there. Okay. Next one, I've already talked about this one in a previous video. Definitely check that one out. I'm just going to cover this rather briefly because I have talked about it in a previous video. But glanders and melioidosis are caused by Burkholderia malii, which is glanders, and Burkholderia pseudomalii. They're gram-negative bacilli bacteria. Glanders, of course, has been used in pre-modern warfare. In pre-modern warfare, it caused massive outbreaks and mortality in horses. During the Civil War, for instance, I talked more about that in the video. In World War I, German saboteurs intentionally infected horses in neutral countries destined for the Triple Entente. So they would inject horses with glanders. This happened in the United States. It was kind of a scandal more than anything. It was tested, of course, on human beings at Unit 731, which is hideous and horrible. It actually was produced and used by Unit 100, which is kind of lesser known, but again, the Japanese sort of biological weapons program in World War II. And the USSR was really interested in this. They tested this frequently. It's been suggested that they used this in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, typically, glanders and melioidosis are endemic to Southeast Asia, Latin America, and in the case of melioidosis, Australia as well. It really survives in the soil and water, and in rainy seasons and typhoons, it can spread these bacteria. It's transmitted through inhalation and ingestion. Horse handlers are the most likely to become infected. Immunocompromised people, such as those with diabetes, HIV/AIDS, those with chronic kidney disease, those that are on steroids, those with alcoholism, are more at risk of these bacteria. They cause granulomatous infections, which show up as like swollen lymph nodes, pneumonia, skin infections, sepsis, delirium, confusion, jaundice, diarrhea, respiratory distress, and shock, leading to death. You can also have chronic carriers that have abscesses that form, which are quite nasty. Mortality is quite high, 20% if it's a localized infection, but over 50% if it becomes septic. Diagnosis is typically through culture. It's not a super common bacteria. Most microbiology labs aren't thinking about it if it does occur, so it's not something that they initially consider. Serology and then PCR has conflicting evidence of efficacy for that one. Treatment, of course, is prolonged antibiotics. So usually the newer generation cephalosporins or your beta-lactams, it's resistant to other antibiotics, and it usually requires weeks to months of treatment. This one is a B tier. I'm gonna do like that. It has a very high mortality. It's been useful historically for especially these horse-based cavalry and artillery units. It can infect the environment. Antibiotics are effective, but the resistance is high, and long-term antibiotics are needed. It's not as effective in a post-horse era, in the military or industrial agriculture. If we were in that time period, I'd probably put this in A tier. But as it stands, this is a solid B tier. This is a pretty scary one. All right, let's talk about hantaviruses. Now, hantaviruses are kind of a family of single-strand RNA viruses. They've been studied for biological weapons potential. The big trick with them is that they're very difficult to culture, isolate, and purify. It causes 150 to 200,000 cases annually. It's carried by rodents, and typically, with urbanization as well as with climate change, the number of cases are increasing, and there's more human-rodent contact that way. Typically, it's done through body fluids or contaminated food or contaminated things like in the environment. There can be person-to-person transmission, but that's typically only the Andes virus version of the hantavirus. It's also environmentally stable as well, which is kind of risky. Agricultural workers, shipping and warehouse staff, as well as soldiers are predisposed to developing hantavirus infections. The soldiers wouldn't surprise me at first, but then you have to think about, soldiers work and live in holes, basically. They work in places where there are lots of rodents around, in dirty sort of environments, they're going to be more likely to be exposed to these kind of things. Typically, it causes, there's a couple of different syndromes that can come about from this. There's the cardiopulmonary syndrome, which causes fever, headache, muscle aches, chills. It can lead to wet lung, which is pulmonary edema, as well as shock. Mortality in these cases is about 12%. And then, in China, over 90% of the cases are the cardiopulmonary syndrome. The hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, it causes fever, headache, muscle aches, chills, and acute kidney failure. This one has a much higher mortality, about 35 to 50%, and typically we see this in South America and especially Brazil. Now, it's typically diagnosed through serology and PCR. There's no vaccines approved by the US FDA. The Republic of Korea has a vaccine for several strains of hantavirus, but not all of them. Early antiviral therapy has been suggested as a treatment, and it's not particularly effective if there's already pulmonary edema. It has to be disinfected with something like 70% ethanol or strong detergents. You know, with all these things put together, I'd say this one's a B tier. So basically, this one has a very high mortality. It's spread by rodents. It contaminates the food supply. Vaccines generally only cover 1 or 2 strains, so there's not a lot of good vaccines out there. It is difficult to manufacture, and there's only one virus that actually has a human-to-human transmission, so that limits it. But I think this one is quite scary. I think it does have potential as a biological weapons agent. Alright, Japanese bee encephalitis. I just put this as Japanese encephalitis. People will know what you're talking about if you're talking about it like that. It is a mosquito-borne flavivirus. It's been studied. It has a theoretical potential, but it's not exactly clear how this would be weaponized from what I've read. It's endemic to Japan and East Asia, as the name implies. It's spread by mosquitoes. Typically in warm and wet weather, when mosquitoes reproduce, this is when it becomes more common. There are several reservoir species, including birds, especially herons and egrets for some reason, because I think they're bigger-bodied birds. They have more viral replication in them. It also can infect pigs as a reservoir species, but you see clinical disease in humans, horses, and cattle. There's about 20,000 cases annually and about 6,000 deaths annually from this one. It causes an asymptomatic infection in many cases, but it can cause fever, headache, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, swelling of the brain, and meninges, so meningoencephalitis, which can lead to fever, seizures, muscle rigidity, and photophobia, and death in some cases as well. Mortality is around like 30% or so, and you can get long-lasting neurological impairments in the survivors. This one is diagnosed through viral isolation, serology, that kind of thing. Treatment and control, I mean, this one is, there are multiple vaccines that are very, very effective. This is one that's recommended for travelers that are going to be going out into East Asian countries, places where there are a lot of mosquitoes, especially during the wet season. This is one you should be getting vaccinated for at your travel clinic. There's some sort of experimental drugs that have mitigate neurological effects, but none of them are proven. Again, mosquito control is beneficial in these cases, so insecticides, netting, that kind of thing. This one is a C tier, and you might be a little bit surprised about that. There you go. It's similar to the equine encephalitis virus, has many potential hosts and reservoirs. Again, mosquito-borne, which there are pros and cons. High mortality, but there's very good vaccinations that are very easy to acquire. And again, this one is not exactly clear how it would be weaponized. I think this one has a lot more potential. This one is a definite C tier. Now these next two are really scary stuff. This is quite nasty. So the Marburg and the Ebola. Marburg doesn't sound scary, but trust me on this one. It causes hemorrhagic fever. They are filoviruses. Now this one is kind of interesting. According to Thucydides, there was a big plague of a hemorrhagic fever that happened in Athens during the Peloponnesian War. And to my personal interpretation, I'd say that's a possible Ebola or Marburg virus. They said it came from Africa, which is where they're typically endemic to. The Marburg virus gets its name from an outbreak in Marburg, Germany in 1967. That was linked to monkeys that were being imported from Uganda into Germany. It's been studied extensively by the USSR, the US, and the Russian Federation. It's been suggested that North Korea tried to study this. I'm not 100% sure or could verify that, to be honest with you, but The Shinriko cult, again, they were trying to acquire this one. That would have been disastrous if they did, but they didn't, so that's good. It's spread by bodily fluids, so natural transmission typically that's how it's done, but it can be aerosolized in laboratory conditions, which is terrifying. All known outbreaks have been traced back to Central Africa. It's believed that wild monkeys are the natural reservoir species for this, and some infections have been linked to the consumption and trade of bushmeat. Egyptian fruit bats have been proven to be the reservoir species for Marburg virus and have been suggested so for Ebola as well. It typically causes a hemorrhagic fever that's quite severe. It can incubate for 5 to 7 days, and the clinical signs are typically that of fever, headache, muscle pain, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea. Occasionally they'll get coughing, then they'll start getting this purplish red rash, which is purpura hemorrhagica, hemorrhage, and then subcutaneous bruising, that's hematomas, eventually causes shock and death. The case fatality rate for these ones is over 50%. That's terrifying. It's diagnosed through serology and immunoassays, typically treated through strict isolation and quarantine procedures. There's no vaccine or viral therapy yet that has been proven to work. It's affected with dilute bleach. This is an S tier. I'm not going to hide that one. That's S tier. That's scary stuff. Very high case fatality rate, potential for aerosol transmission, a week-long incubation period, meaning that you could be infected for it for 5 to 7 days, infect your friends and family, and spread that one around. And there's no treatment or vaccine that works for it. This one keeps me up at night. This is terrifying. I'm just going to sip my tea here. The plague, Yersinia pestis. This is a gram-negative coccobacillus. Of course, you know the plague. This one's pretty well known. It caused believed to cause the Justinian plague of the 6th century, the Black Death, as we know, in the 14th century, and of course the modern pandemic of the 19th century. Each of these killed millions of people. The Black Death killed about a third of the population of Europe, it's believed. And the modern pandemic that started in the end of the 19th to the beginning of the 20th century killed about 12 million people. Medieval armies, like the Mongols, but other armies as well, would catapult cadavers and heads into the fortifications of their enemies that were infected with plague and then spread plague that way. So this one is probably the oldest biological weapons agent on this list. World War II, it was experimented with by Unit 731. It saw limited use by the Japanese in China and Manchuria, which is horrifying. And it's been researched extensively by the Americans and the Soviets. The Americans were unsuccessful at producing stable Yersinia pestis, and they stopped their work in the 1970s. Of course, the USSR continued work on these sort of things until the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR in 1991. It's two different kinds of plagues that we really are concerned about here today. Bubonic plague, which is transmitted by rat fleas, which are carried by rodents like rats or squirrels, including ground squirrels, which we commonly call gophers. If you are interacting with wild ground squirrels, you could potentially contract the plague, which don't do that. Pneumonic plague is spread by aerosolized particles. They've actually done studies on aerosolizing these things, which is kind of scary to me, but 50 kilograms of aerosolized Yersinia pestis released over a city of 5 million people could theoretically cause about 150,000 cases, I should say, and 36,000 cases initially. Now, if the city was unprepared, the city could have up to 90% infection rate and a 60 to 70% case fatality rate. Terrifying. This thing scares me. Clinical manifestations for the bubonic plague, basically it causes swollen lymph nodes that are called buboes. Not those kind of buboes, different kind, very gross. Fever, chills, headache, myalgia, lethargy, swollen lymph nodes with the surrounding edema, the buboes that I mentioned there, and altered brain functions are typical clinical signs for the bubonic plague. Over 50% of people with bubonic plague die without antibiotics, and about 5% die with antibiotics. The septicemic plague is a secondary to pneumonic or bubonic plague, and typically it's spread from the flea bites, basically. Typically, there's no buboes present from this one, but it does cause fever, vomiting, diarrhea, lethargy. It can cause a septic shock. It causes what we call disseminated intravascular coagulopathy, DIC, better known to us veterinarians and other medical professionals as death is coming. Basically, all the coagulation factors get used up, and you bleed out from every orifice and into every soft tissue mucosa. Terrifying stuff. Horrible. It does cause death as well. The pneumonic plague is the final form that I'll mention. Well, I'll mention a couple others as well. It causes fever, headache, tachycardia, myalgia, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, cough, chest pain, tachypnea, which means faster breathing, dyspnea is trouble breathing, bloody sputum, so coughing up blood, and then lung consolidation and necrosis, which means your lungs are dying and filling up with material. The plague also causes meningitis. It can cause swollen pharynx, so your throat basically. It can cause abortion in pregnant people and animals, and it can cause stillbirth in those pregnant people and animals as well. It's diagnosed through clinical signs, chest x-rays, but culture and postmortem and immunofluorescence and serology. There's many different ways of diagnosing the plague basically. Now, typically it responds well to antibiotics. There are isolation and quarantine procedures usually recommended that, and there are vaccines available, but again, they cause a lot of vaccine reactions with those ones, so they're only recommended for high-risk people. Now, you may disagree with me on this one, but I think this is an S tier. The plague does scare me quite a lot. It has a massive potential for mass casualties. It has been used for centuries as a biological weapons, and it probably will still be in the future. It is treatable with antibiotics currently. However, we're living through an antibiotic apocalypse. I don't know if you know this. There are a lot of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The plague could become antibiotic resistant, especially if it's being manufactured in a lab. It's actually rather trivial to produce antibiotic-resistant bacteria in a lab. There are also multiple routes of infection through aerosols, as well as through fleas on rodents. This one could potentially be a major problem if anyone actually ever used that. That one scares me. You may say that's more A tier because you can treat it with antibiotics, but the quickness of how much infection there could be, even if there was antibiotics that worked well for this, meant that it could basically cause societal breakdown to the point where you run out of antibiotics, you run out of medicine, and people start dying rapidly. That scares me. That's why I put it in this tier. All right. Next one is called Psittacosis. This one's a little less catastrophic. It's called Chlamydia psittaci. So it's a form of chlamydia. It's a gram-negative obligate intracellular bacteria, meaning that it has to live inside of a cell. It's called parrot fever, which it's because it's associated with parrot fanciers in the United States and North America. It's been studied as a bioweapon by the US, the USSR, and the Chinese. The potential for it basically was studied primarily for its effect on poultry farms and poultry workers. It did cause a few outbreaks when it was being studied by the Americans at Fort Detrick in 1945 and 1961. It basically is carried by birds, especially parrots, hence the name parrot fever. It's a very important disease for me as a veterinarian to know about. It causes inflammation of the placenta in sheep, cattle, and horses. In cattle, it causes fever and upper respiratory tract infections. It also causes a lack of milk production. Dogs and cats typically get an upper respiratory tract infection with that. The most at-risk people are people like me, veterinarians, farm workers, bird fanciers, and pet store employees. Person-to-person transmission is possible, but it is pretty rare. This can incubate for up to 39 days. Usually it's less than 2 weeks though. It can cause fever, headache, dry cough, fatigue, swollen throat, pharyngitis is what we call it, diarrhea, changes in mental status, so coma or stupor or depression, that kind of thing. Atypical pneumonia, so it causes inflammation of the lungs that way. Sometimes it can cause neurological signs, but that's rare. It can cause dermatological lesions, so skin lesions. It also can cause endocarditis and myocarditis, so that's inflammation of the heart, nasty stuff. Renal disease, liver disease, and hematological disease can occur. It also causes fetal death through the inflammation of the placenta. Now, there's a huge clinical range for this one, so it's hard to generalize. It can be asymptomatic in healthy individuals. It could also cause death. Without treatment, there's a 20% fatality rate, but with treatment, it's less than 1%. Diagnosis is typically dependent on clinical findings as well as PCR and serology. This is one that, if someone has a bird at home and you start showing signs of upper respiratory tract infection and pneumonia, like a chronic cough that doesn't go away and gets worse, that's something you need to tell your doctor about. That's pretty scary. You should definitely let them know about it. It is treatable with antibiotics. There are antibiotic-resistant strains, so yeah. This one is a D tier, I think. I might be wrong on that one. Maybe I should rank it a little bit higher, but it can cause a lot of disruptions to poultry and livestock operations for sure, as well as for the veterinarians and the people working on them that way. There are potentials for antibiotic-resistant strains to be produced. There's low human-to-human transmission, and the fact that it's an obligate intracellular bacteria means that it's difficult to culture and produce that way. So this one has potential. It's not very high. I'd say that one is a D tier. Okay, now we're going to talk about Q fever. I'm just going to have a drink of my tea here. There we go. Q fever is caused by Coxiella burnetii, which is a gram-negative obligate intracellular bacteria, kind of like our chlamydia bacteria that we just talked about. So it was studied by the USA and the Soviet Union. Again, this one's a very difficult one to culture, very similar to psittacosis that way. This one has a very different epidemiology though. It's spread around the world except for New Zealand. It's the reservoir species are not birds, but rather ruminant animals like cattle. It can be spread by birds though, and it can also be found in arthropods. In livestock, it typically causes spontaneous abortions as well as lack of milk production or infertility. And it's transmitted through bodily fluids like milk and as well as ticks, which is kind of nasty. It's a tick-borne illness as well. Person-to-person transmission is rather rare. It is very environmentally stable, and you can actually produce aerosolized forms of this, which can travel far on the wind, and the infectious dose is very low, so only a few organisms are needed to cause infection. It can cause chronic endocarditis or osteomyelitis, which is basically bone infection. It can cause chronic arthritis as well as chronic hepatitis or fatigue. The pneumonic form of the disease is asymptomatic. It can lead to coughing, fever, or respiratory distress. There's only about a 1% mortality rate with this one, however. It can be rather difficult to diagnose because it's kind of vague clinical signs. Typically you need serology, but sometimes if you can find the actual organism, you can also do PCR that way. PCR is polymerase chain reaction, if I didn't make that clear, but it's just one of the ways that we can replicate the DNA in large numbers so we can identify the organism that causes it, basically. It's one of the new kids on the block in terms of identifying and diagnosing these diseases. Treatment, it's typically responds to doxycycline. However, it's not quite clear how efficacious it is. There are vaccines available. They're typically only used in high risk cases, so people who are going to be exposed to this one. It also has a high risk of adverse reactions. Tick control can help prevent it, so having your dogs and cats on a flea tick preventative, it again prevents a lot of different kinds of tick-borne illnesses. I'm a big advocate for that. It, using DEET while you're out in the deep woods, again, is another way you can protect yourself against tick-borne diseases. The disinfecting environments with Lysol, hydrogen peroxide, 70% ethanol, or chloroform are good ways of actually preventing that one. Now, this one's a C tier. This one, I'd say, it has a low infectious dose. It's very environmentally stable. It has a huge potential to disrupt livestock operations. It does have a low mortality rate. It is difficult to culture, and there are some vaccines that are available. I think this one has a bigger potential to cause disruptions than psittacosis. I'm not 100% convinced of the ranking myself. It may be more D tier, more C tier. It's kind of middle of the road, I think, in terms of that. Now, Rift Valley fever. This is caused by the Rift Valley virus. This one was actually used by the Allies in World War II. So the American, the British, and the Canadian civilian scientists were studying that because they were worried the Germans would actually weaponize this virus in particular as a biological weapon. So which is kind of ironic. You know, they wanted to produce this one so the Germans wouldn't. I don't know. I don't buy that reasoning, but there you go. After World War II, the U.S. continued studies into it into the 1970s. This is again a part of Operation Whitecoat, meaning that this was tested on human subjects, volunteers, quote unquote, and you know, volunteers as in they took a U.S. soldier, told them that we're volunteering for something, and then they infected them with a potentially fatal disease. Yay! Nasty stuff. It is endemic to Eastern Africa, Madagascar, and the Arabian Peninsula. It's transmitted by mosquitoes, handling blood and organs from infected livestock. Epizootic infections, basically from between animals. They're more common during the rainy season and at lower altitude when there's lots of mosquitoes reproducing. Severe disease can be found in HIV-positive patients, which is why Rift Valley fever is so common in those regions. The quote-unquote mild disease for this causes fever, aches, abdominal pain, vomiting, anorexia, which means loss of appetite, weakness, nosebleed, sweating, and constipation. But there are severe forms of this disease as well, which cause liver disease. So it causes jaundice of the skin, neurological symptoms, and hemorrhagic fever, and ultimately death in the severe form. In the outbreak, so the actual case fatality rate is kind of debated for this one. In a 6-month outbreak, it caused a 14% fatality rate in one endemic region. It's diagnosed typically through serology. There is a vaccine available at the U.S. Army's Special Immunizations Program. They developed that because they were testing it on U.S. soldiers. And it's only available for lab workers in the U.S. and not available for people, which I think is a shame if you live in an endemic area that this is being withheld, but that's my personal opinion. There's not really any effective treatments for it otherwise. This one is a B tier, actually. I'd say this one is actually kind of scary that way. Oh, there you go. It has economic potential and for disruptions. There are vaccines, but they're only experimental at this point. You need to have very good environmental conditions to facilitate transmission. It has a low case fatality rate on its own, but it has a lot of potential to disrupt things for HIV-positive patients in certain areas of the world. This one could cause a lot more issues, I think, than some of our other mosquito-borne viruses that we found. Okay, just a few more. We're getting close to the end here. Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever. This is caused by one of my favorite named organisms called Rickettsia. I hope I pronounced that correctly. As far as I know, it's been suggested by the CDC that it could be used as a biological weapon agent, but its use I don't think has ever been studied or really tried in a significant capacity. It is endemic, as you can expect from, well, actually no, it's kind of the name is extremely misleading because it's not endemic at all to the Rocky Mountains, but the Appalachians and the Mississippi region. So terrible naming, guys. I don't know why they call it that, but it's transmitted by several different ticks, especially the American dog tick, which is Rhiphocephalus sanguinus, the Dermacentor variabilis, and Dermacentor andersoni, which is the deer tick and the Rocky Mountain wood tick. I think that's probably why they call it Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever, to come to think of it, but again, terrible name. It causes flu-like symptoms such as fever, chills, headache, muscle pain, fatigue, and vomiting and anorexia. And then it causes a characteristic spotted rash for about 5 to 6 days afterwards. Typically without treatment, it can cause a fatality rate of about 20%. It's diagnosed through PCR and immunohistochemistry. It's treated with doxycycline, which is again one of those antibiotics that works well for these kind of tick-borne diseases. There used to be a vaccine on the market for this one. It's been taken off the market. I've actually been vaccinated for this one. Funny story, my dad actually vaccinated for this one when I was a kid because he knew it was coming off the market. I was playing computer games and he came up behind me, bam, jammed me with the needle. He was a doctor, so it was all good. Sounds terrifying in retrospect, but actually, you know, fond memory. Anyway, there's no vaccines on the market for that one. Tick control again is important. If you are, have your animals out in the wild, make sure they're on a regular monthly tick preventative in any endemic region. If you're going out into tick-borne regions, wear insect repellent with DEET in it to prevent you getting infected with this sort of thing. This one is a D tier. It's a bad one to be sure. If you get infected with that, Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever is not good. However, as a biological weapon, Antibiotics and vaccines can be produced. I mean, there's no vaccine really on the market at this point. Antibiotics are effective against it. Tick control is also effective, preventing infection. I would say I'm kind of surprised that this one was recommended by, or was studied, the CDC classifies it as a possible biological weapon. However, I think something like Lyme disease or something like one of the other tick-borne diseases could potentially be more fatal or more severe. So I'm kind of surprised that it was ever classified as a possible biological weapons agent, to be 100% honest with you there. This one is, again, a D tier. It's more serious than something like diphtheria, it's more serious than something like Coccidioides or some of our other ones. It's definitely a scary one, but it's not one I think has a lot of potential. I also don't know exactly how you would get this into ticks and then spread it around that way unless you were farming ticks, which I don't know how you would do. I guess you could if you had like someone who's willing to get bit by large amounts of ticks or something, or like animals. It's not exactly clear to me how you would work this out, but I'd say for now we'll put it in D tier. Okay, so you probably know about our next one, smallpox. This one is probably one of the few on the list that are not veterinary, but we'll still talk about it anyway because smallpox is scary. It's caused by a variola virus, which is a pox virus. This one is famous for being used during the 7 Years' War, which is called the French and Indian War in the United States, I believe. The British soldiers distributed contaminated smallpox blankets to American Indians, which led to epidemics that killed half the population. Nice, real nice. Hasn't really been used very much since then, but has been studied for potential that way. Now, this one is the only one on the list that has been eradicated. The pox vaccine was, of course, invented in 1796, and mass vaccination campaigns led to its eradication in 1977. It does exist in laboratories around the world, so it is one that has technically been eradicated, but it's just waiting for the wrong person to come around to unleash it on the world again. It's transmitted through aerosols, so through like spit and breathing, that kind of thing. Contaminated bedding as well. It's been estimated that 10 to 20 cases can emerge from a single case, and it typically happens more frequently in winter months when people are inside. Eczema, malignant cancers, HIV positive status, hereditary immunosuppressive disorders, as well as pregnant people are more at risk of developing smallpox, severe forms of smallpox. This one is a very characteristic manifestation. It tends to incubate for about 2 weeks, which is quite scary. It means that it can spread quite around before you start showing symptoms. It shows up as flu-like symptoms at first with fever, malaise, headache, backache, abdominal pain. It can then progress to delirium. It has a very characteristic maculopapular rash, which turns into vesicles and then pustules, which burst. The hemorrhagic form is very rare and fatal, and it basically causes petechiae, which is little blood spots on the gums, hemorrhage, bruising, and death. The malignant version of this sort of thing causes lesions. They don't really develop into pustules, and this version is more fatal. That's kind of variola major. Variola minor, which is the other form of smallpox, is a milder clinical signs and more sparse rash, so that's really the differentiating factors that way clinically. The fatality rate in unvaccinated individuals is about 1 in 3, so this one is actually quite severe. It's diagnosed based on clinical signs, serology, electron microscopy of pustules. There's no effective treatment protocol for smallpox, but vaccines are very preventative and they can help control clinical disease in the recently exposed. Now, this is one where we used to vaccinate basically everyone for smallpox because it was such a big risk to human civilization. We don't anymore because it's the risk of vaccine reactions and the fact that it's been exterminated means we don't really need to worry about it as much. People who are at risk of developing smallpox infections are vaccinated, or other pox virus ones. So you may have heard of the monkeypox thing that was going around. I actually got the monkeypox vaccine because, you see my videos, I'm one of the queers. So it's one of those ones that, people who are at risk get vaccinated for smallpox, laboratory workers, that kind of thing. But it does, pox viruses are very easy to prevent against that way with the vaccines. That said, most people aren't vaccinated. This one I'd say is A tier, and some people may disagree with me on that ranking, but it has a very high case fatality rate, extremely transmissible, it has a long incubation period, there's no effective treatment, and vaccination, while it's very effective, is not commonly done for everywhere, which is why I put it in A tier and not S tier. But that one is scary. Smallpox is incredibly scary. It deserves to be an A tier. All right, just a couple more left. Tularemia is caused by Francisella tularensis, the aerobic gram-negative Coccidioides. Its use, it's actually been studied quite frequently as a biological weapon. It was used at the infamous Unit 731 again, another Japanese bioweapons program in the World War II. It was believed that it may have been used on the Eastern Front of World War II, I think by Germany. However, it's not quite clear to me exactly if this was done or if this has just been suspected. The US military studied it for aerosolization, vaccines, and antibiotics, again with quote-unquote volunteers. That they were basically soldiers told to volunteer. They were infected with this potentially fatal organism. Great. It is endemic to North America and Europe. Its reservoir species are rodents, rabbits, and hares. Hunters and trappers are actually especially at risk of this one. It's extremely infectious, with only 10 organisms needed to establish a clinical infection. It can contaminate the water, the soil, and vegetation in an area. It's typically spread by biting arthropods like mosquitoes, ticks, and biting flies. It can spread by infected tissue and blood, and inhalation of the aerosolized form of it. So the aerosolized form of it has been studied as a potential biological weapon. It's been estimated that a 50-kilogram aerosolized Francisella tularensis over a city of 5 million people would lead to 250,000 incapacitating casualties and 19,000 deaths. It causes, it basically incubates for about 1 to 14 days. It can cause fever, aches, dry cough, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, malaise, loss of appetite, and weight loss. It causes many different sort of disease forms. So the ocular glandular form causes conjunctivitis, photophobia, which means fear of the light, and they often get tearing from the eyes due to that. Swollen submaxillary and cervical lymph nodes. The ulceral glandular form basically causes cutaneous skin lesions. The oropharyngeal form, as you can imagine, causes oropharyngeal ulcers, so big mouth ulcers, sore throat, pharyngitis, tonsillitis, that kind of thing. The pneumonic form causes bronchitis and pleuropneumonia, so a form of bacterial pneumonia that's quite nasty. It basically can progress, there's basically a slower progression to the pneumonia than plague or anthrax, but it's still quite severe. The fatality is up to 60% for pneumonic form, but 5 to 15% is a commonly seen sort of fatality rate for this one. It's diagnosed based on cytology of respiratory secretions, culture, antigen detection, and PCR. There was an experimental vaccine in the USSR and America, but it's not currently on the market. Multiple antibiotics work. Doxycycline and ciprofloxacin are typically used for it. You typically need to isolate affected people that have this one. This one I'd say is a B tier. So tularemia, there are of course multiple modes of infection which make it more serious. It's easily aerosolized as for the initial sort of infectious attack. Has a high case fatality rate. It's stable in the environment. There's no widely available vaccines. It's treatable with antibiotics, but again, antibiotic resistance is increasing. You can also engineer resistant strains fairly easily. It's also a slower transmission than plague or anthrax, so it has to be lower than anthrax, I think, and lower than the plague. I think this is a solid B tier. This one is scary, but it's not the worst on these lists, and we have some pretty nasty ones on the list. All right, one to go. Thanks for sticking with me so far. So yellow fever. Yellow fever is caused by, surprise, surprise, yellow fever virus, which is an RNA flavivirus. I don't think it's ever actually been seriously developed as a biological weapon, but it has been studied. It's endemic to Africa and Latin America. It was believed to have spread from Africa to Latin America during the transatlantic slave trade. It's transmitted by the Aedes genus of mosquitoes. It is, the reservoir is wild monkeys, so monkeys will replicate the virus, they'll develop illness, and the mosquitoes will spread it from monkeys to humans that way. There are about 200,000 annual cases and about 30,000 annual deaths. It clinically manifests as an acute hemorrhagic hepatonephritis. Basically, that means that bleeding, inflammation of the liver and the kidneys. Nasty. The acute phase typically shows up as flu-like symptoms of fever, muscle ache, backache, headache, anorexia, nausea, and vomiting. Most patients will recover after about 3 to 4 days of that. The second phase causes acute liver failure, which is jaundice, abdominal pain, hemorrhage of the mouth, nose, eye, stomach, that kind of thing, as well as acute kidney failure. Only about 15% of cases go on to this stage, though. Fatality rate is about 50% without treatment, so that's quite severe. It's diagnosed by serum, serology, and it typically is, there's a vaccine available. It's a live attenuated vaccine. It's very safe. It has very long-lasting protection. So anyone who lives in endemic regions with yellow fever, this is a good one to be vaccinated for. Symptomatic treatment is caused, with fluids and anti-inflammatories like other kinds of viral infections. And of course, mosquito prevention, such as insecticides and netting, are preventative. This one I think is a C tier. As you can imagine, it has a high fatality rate without treatment. It's mosquito-borne. Again, pros and cons with mosquitoes as a vector. It's very geographically restricted to warm tropical regions, and there's a very good vaccine available for it. So that's kind of where I would put it on the list. You may disagree with the rankings here, but that basically sums up what I have today for biological weapons. These are some very terrifying things. Basically, every government in the world, as I said, has looked into these sort of things, and terrorist groups around the world are trying to use some of these to cause death and suffering. And this is something that I want everyone to know about. This is why I put it in kind of this flashy format. I'm not the best at making videos, but I do want to get this information out there. There isn't a tier list yet for this, and that's why I wanted to add it to YouTube. Let me know what you think about this format. If this is something you want to see more of, I can definitely make more in the future. If you thought, you prefer my sort of face-to-face sort of interactions, I'm happy to show my face on YouTube despite the comments I sometimes get on YouTube. I don't care. It's my channel. I just delete the comments anyway. So thank you so much for sticking around and watching this video. Hopefully it's provided you some information. Hopefully, you think about the potential for these things. You tell your friends and family about, the potential for biological weapons. That's all I had to say. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. Cheers. Peace.